Welcome back to another episode of Focus on EDU, EdTech, and the Education Experience. I'm your host, Doug Konopelko from CDW Education, and I am thrilled for today's episode. So excited. Our guest today, we have had a lot of different folks on this show before, teachers, administrators, people in industry, all different folks. We've definitely never had somebody from the U.S. Department of Education. So I am thrilled to be bringing you Kristina Ishmael, and we're gonna go right in. So Kristina, give us a little bit about your background in education and just a quick intro.
Great. It's so great to be here with you, Doug. I know we've been planning this for a while, so it makes me really happy that it's happening. So hello, everyone. My name is Kristina Ishmael. My pronouns are she and her. I serve as the acting director of the Office of Educational Technology here at the U.S. Department of Education. Yes, there is such an office. And prior to this, I served in a variety of roles within education. I've been in the field for over 15 years. Started out as an early childhood and elementary teacher in Omaha, Nebraska, to a large majority of emerging bilingual students, served as an EL teacher, and then moved to the state level where I was the state EdTech director for the state of Nebraska. And then I moved out to DC in 2016 towards the end of the Obama administration and served in this office as a fellow leading a project called Go Open, which was supporting school districts and states as they moved to the use of open educational resources. And then I got to continue that work after I left the department at a traditional kind of DC speak, a think tank called New America on their education policy program and their public interest technology program. From there, I've just been doing the work and serving well over 400 districts, over 30 states, as they all kind of made that transition away from traditional textbooks and materials to the use of OER, and then have been able to stay in this space waiting for something in the new administration. I was incredibly blessed to be a part of the Biden-Harris transition team as the technology strategy and delivery liaison, and served under Linda Darling-Hammond, who was leading that work, and again, kind of patiently waiting for something to come up in the administration. And now I get to come back and lead this office, which was truly kind of one of those moments in my professional career that changed my trajectory. And so now I get to lead the office.
That's incredible. So many great experiences in there that we could spend a lot of time on, but
Yeah.
we're going to stick with this one today. So,
Okay.
a lot of folks that come on the show, we have sort of a more traditional theme, and we're going to talk about VR today or things like that. So for you, with the role that you have, we're going to stick pretty closely there, right? So let's start
Okay.
with you do work in a very interesting place. So where does maybe the Department of Education sit within the U.S. government, just as a start?
Yeah, so great question. We are one of many agencies that you will find in the US government, and we were actually not established until I believe it was the 60s and 70s. We were part of another agency and then pulled out separately to really focus on education by itself. I'm trying to remember that one presentation that I got back in 2016 of like, here's how ed came to be. And I say ed because here's a fun fact. This is something that I talk about a lot on Twitter. We are the U.S. Department of Ed, or U.S. Ed. We are not DOE, because that is actually the Department of Energy. Whereas a lot of states have their DOEs, and that's cool. But that is an entirely different agency, and they do very different work than we do here at Ed. So we are one of, gosh, I can't even remember how many agencies there are, but similar to a Department of Energy or Homeland Security or FEMA, any of these agencies that you think of when you think of government. Of course, we focus on education, and it is early learning through K-12, all the way through higher education. And then, of course, we go into workforce. And so I know that there's like cradle to grave. Seems very kind of morbid.
Yeah. Let's keep the grave references to a minimum on today. Keep it happy. No.
Yes. But we serve everyone, truly, like across all ages, and so it's a broad spectrum.
Okay, perfect. That sets a good stage for us. So now, what role do you play within the department?
Yeah. So again, I lead the Office of EdTech, and we are in the Office of Policy Evaluation Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. I get my two P's mixed up. We're the policy shop. And so we are one of 7 offices that all work together to work on policy, whether that's through our grants program office, our student privacy policy office, our chief data office. All of these are part of the planning, evaluation, and policy development. And then, of course, OET is part of that. I report directly to Assistant Secretary Roberto Rodriguez, who reports directly to Secretary Cardona. And so historically, we had been in a different kind of organizational structure, and we were much more kind of targeted and closer relationships with the White House. Now we've brought it really internal so that we can work internally and make sure that ed tech and all things digital are considered in policy development, which is really important, especially given the past 2 years. And then, of course, we still do all of our external engagement and our collective action. One of my absolute favorite words that I learned very early on from moving to the department level here in 16 was the bully pulpit. And I didn't quite understand that. Like I knew going to the state level that there was a certain kind of caliber of things that you could and could not do, especially kind of setting standards and making sure that school districts were able to execute there. But then you go up to that 100,000-foot view, and that's exactly where we sit for the federal government. And so we get to leverage the bully pulpit. We get to make sure that folks are paying attention to certain things or highlight different work that's happening. Of course, our focus with this administration has been on recovery and coming back into schools. And then, of course, we lift up all the stories around the relief dollars and how schools and states have been able to use that. And then, of course, we happen to be joining together here this week because it's not only public service kind of celebration week, but it's also teacher appreciation week. And those two, I don't think that it's a coincidence that those two things fall on the same week.
Absolutely. So what does a day in the life look like for you working at Ed?
No 2 days are the same.
Yeah, I think that's education in general, right? Nothing is ever the same day to day.
Exactly. It's so funny that our favorite word during quarantine and when the pandemic first hit was pivot, because that's kind of always been the word that we use in education is like, oh, that lesson didn't go so well, so we're going to pivot. We're going to change that. Educators are naturally gifted at that, and it comes from practice. So I would say a lot of my days consist of meetings, back-to-back meetings. It's also really interesting because I've been in the office since October when I officially started in this role, and all political appointees came back in person in October. I accepted the job thinking that I was teleworking. Fun fact. That was not the case. And so I've been in the office since October, and when we plan these back-to-back meetings, we're also planning these in a hybrid situation because we do have career staff members that are still remote and they're still teleworking. And so we want to make sure that everyone is included in those meetings. But what I forget about most of the time is like that buffer, that transition time. And so I will often be late to my meetings because I'm like running from a floor to jump on a meeting and make sure that I can join everyone. All of that to say, it is robust with meetings to talk about policy, to talk about kind of you name it. We also do a lot of kind of, again, the engagement piece, and part of that is even internal engagement. And so meeting with my colleagues in other offices and making sure that we are represented in whatever work they're doing. And yeah, and then I go home and I work more, which also may sound familiar, but then that's catching up on all the emails and kind of running through all of the clearance documents. People don't necessarily understand that, but like when a policy goes out, whether it's a grant notice or a new Dear Colleague letter or anything that's policy related, everyone in the agency gets to review it. And I find that really interesting, and it's an opportunity for us to kind of think about ways that we can insert tech, ed tech specifically, but then also anything digital and kind of align to our office priorities. And so I would say that's it's pretty common to be like meetings all day, catch up, email, do the reviews at night. It may change depending on where I am. I know that we recently got to see each other in person at a conference, at an in-person conference. And that is also part of my work is the travel and making sure that folks know that we are around and we have a team and we exist and we're here to help, which is not what people think of the federal government necessarily sometimes, but we are here.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny talking about the in-person conferences too, right? Because I've been traveling since last May, actually, so almost a year back on the road. And what's funny is as I go to each one of these shows, it's like everybody's first show back. And it
Yeah.
seems like for the entire last year. So even like up until I was somewhere 2 weeks ago, and they're like, "Isn't it exciting to be traveling again?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, sort of." I mean, like for you, no. So
For you, yes.
yeah, but no, it is great. I love what you said too. It's funny when you think about scheduling things virtually. I can schedule it to end 1 minute and start that
Yep.
very same minute. But if you
Yep.
have to run across a building, that's not real.
I know. I know. We are 7 stories, so oftentimes I am on a completely different story from my own. So yes, that is a real thing.
So part of the connections and the engagement and the policy work includes the National EdTech Plan, right?
Yeah.
So take me through a little bit maybe about maybe what your role was in the past as a fellow, if you were involved in it at all, or what the fellows work is like, and then what is the plan in general, and what does that look like as we build it?
Yeah. So the National Tech Plan is actually the reason why this office exists. It was congressionally mandated in the mid 90s, and that the idea was like people saw that ed tech was going to potentially change education, and so they were like, oh, we should probably do something about this. So through bipartisan support in Congress, they established this office, and then it has had a number of incredible leaders that have served in this office. And the lighthouse publication that comes out of OET is the National Ed Tech Plan. It is kind of refreshed on a cyclical basis. If you think of curriculum adoption, you think every 5-7 years, depending on if you have the budget, but that's essentially what our cycle is here as well. So the current version that we have right now is the 2017 version, and it was technically released in 2016. There were enough changes that it was then documented as the 2017 version. So a fellow at the time worked with the contractor. Zach Chase helped write that under the leadership of Richard Collada, who's now at ISTE. And then they worked with a technical working group to kind of do a lit review, to do the research, to identify all of the ways in which ed tech was going to impact teaching and learning. And then they came up with the 5 domains. And so the most current version has 5 domains, which are learning, teaching, leadership, assessment, and infrastructure. And yes, I have to point to my fingers every time I go through them. But the
Totally fair.
2010 the 2010 version prior to the current version was written by Karen Cater when she was here in this leadership role, and it included similar kind of domains or similar categories. We know that EdTech is going to impact all of these areas. And then the additional one that she had in the 2010 version was around education R&D, which is not something that our office is necessarily focused on, and it has and hasn't. And so we're trying to determine ways in which we can bring some of that work back, actually. And so, yeah, so that is refresh on a cyclical basis. We are in the process right now of putting together an RFP, or request for proposals, that will go up on the Federal Register, which seems very, very official. And we want to award a contract summer. Like I keep saying, like, it's got to be soon. It's got to be soon because we got to get to work. We had started the work prior to the pandemic and then had to push pause. And we've learned a lot in the past 2 years. And so we want to talk about those same domains and make sure that those are all still applicable, and then learn from the things that we have learned in the past 2 years. And then also kind of reincorporate that education R&D piece. What role does ed tech play in that? And so that's where we kind of stand with it right now. You know, we typically do work with a contractor to help us, and then we bring this technical working group together made up of experts across the field that will help inform that. We do the lit review, we do the research, and then we start to workshop it with our invested parties that are all across the country. And so that means that we will workshop it with state leaders, we will workshop it with educational leaders at the district level, we will workshop it with teachers and make sure that it seems applicable to them as well. So once we get that kind of drafted in the outline, and then we start to workshop it and make sure that it seems appropriate, we also incorporate stories and highlight, like best practices or promising practices. Then we move it into kind of final production stages, and then we take it on the road, and then we get to do the road show, which is the dissemination and kind of that communications of, hey, did you know that there's a national ed tech plan? Because a lot of folks don't. and it sits in the public domain, which also means that anyone can use it. So we've seen states take the National EdTech Plan and then revise it, remix it, and then make it specific to their state. We've also seen districts do that as well. They're like, yeah, we believe in these 5 domains in these areas. We're going to do the same thing for our school district. And so we anticipate that that will happen with this new version as well.
Yeah, I think so. When I was in the school district office, right, working in EdTech,
Yeah.
of course, we used it as we were building out our district technology plan. Because a lot of times when you build those, you then have to bring that to the board and present it to the board, and the board's going to push back on 97.6% of what you put in there. And so it's important to have something that you can point to, right, as a district or as a school to say, like, this isn't just us that we're talking about. This is the National EdTech Plan. So, yeah, I think, right. And to your point, it's better when it's used, right? And being used for something like that, I think is a lot of the intended purpose, right? Is to be able to serve as sort of a lighthouse, as you said, to the work. So I guess the next question is, you mentioned that in the 2010 version there was R&D emerging tech. In the 2017 it was gone. Is it? Do you think it's coming back for the 2022-23 version?
I do. I really do. Primarily because we've already identified that within our office priorities, and we want to make sure that everything is mirrored between the priorities and the National EdTech Plan. These are important things. You know, we've always grounded ourselves in current practices and what's happening in classrooms right now. And again, we do serve that broad spectrum. Traditionally, the NETP or the National EdTech Plan is written for K-12. So I do have to kind of specify that. We do have a higher ed supplement, and we will consider trying to do a refresh with that. We have to take it one thing at a time. And so we do ground ourselves in the current practices, but we do have to keep our eye on the horizon of what's coming. And that's where the emerging trends and technologies have to be recognized for their potential there. And so one of our career staff members is focused on right now on AI in education, making sure that we're staying kind of part of that and proactively staying a part of that work. We just launched a blog series all on this, thinking about how we need to think about policy when it comes to AI in education. And we know that that's not the only thing that we have to focus on. So what does AR, VR, XR look like in education? What does esports look like in education? So all of these emerging trends and technologies will certainly have to be considered as well.
And let the record show that I did not mandate that Kristina mention esports in today's episode.
You did not, I promise.
No, I think that's great. And I think that's also one of the areas that I feel like schools most often need some sort of guidance on, right? Because there are a lot of schools do have, really well built out practices around infrastructure and staffing and things like that, right? But they definitely struggle when it comes to, all right, there's a new technology out, right? If we take AI as an example, a lot of times we have to start with how do we just educate people on what AI in education is, because they're probably thinking of, oh, who was the actor? Was it Haley Joel Osment? Who is in AI the movie? I don't know. That was a long time ago now.
I don't know either.
But
that sounds right.
But what's important is that this isn't AI the movie, right? This is like AI in action in education, and it already exists in a lot of places today.
Sure.
And it's understanding how will it then impact, for a lot of your purposes as well, the policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and recognizing that, AI can be just as problematic if we're not on top of things. Yes, the machines run it, but they have to be created by people. Like the algorithms are created by people. And so are we going to replicate our biases in these algorithms and then potentially, cause further harm, especially against historically underserved populations, our students of color, our students with disabilities, our ELs, you name it. So we do have to be a part of these conversations and make sure that developers are thinking about these things right now, so we don't run into future issues. And we can't simply retrofit AI into education like we try to do with so many other things. We need to start those policy conversations right now.
So what does it look like translating some of the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis into policy?
So I get to be a part of some really critical conversations, including our weekly P12 Policy Committee. So that is folks from across the entire agency, anyone from our general counsel's office to our civil rights office to secretaries, like you name it, there's representation there. And I'm part of these conversations that may or may not have anything to do with ed tech or anything digital, but I still get to make sure that I am listening and contributing when it's appropriate. And so that is quite significant for me, particularly because it may not be related to ed tech, but it may be to a question about pedagogy and practice. And we have teachers here at Ed, and I think that's also a kind of an important piece to remember, is that we're making policy, but it's really important to include some of the practitioner voice in that policy and say, hey, so this is how I would interpret this in my classroom. And if that doesn't look so great, let's go back and let's revisit that and talk about some different options. It does not always land well. Because it can be challenging. You have folks that aren't necessarily from the practitioner side. And so you have to come together and say, here's how it could work. Here's how I would interpret this. And like, let's talk through this and brainstorm different options. And so that's a really important role that I play, not just because of the OET side of things, but also because of being a former classroom teacher. And so I would say that's kind of how we contribute to the policy right now. And then once we have the NETP, we will do our own roadshow internally. And so we will make sure that folks know all the ways that we have seen things kind of play out over the past 2 years and even the past 5 years for that matter, since the last version was published, saying here's how we see ed tech and digital learning moving forward for the next 5 to 7 years.
Fantastic. So once you get there, right, once the National EdTech Plan is built and you're on the road show,
yep,
right, then I guess what's next, right? What happens once the plan is done and we're communicating the plan out to not just ed but also to the general public?
yep.
What happens then?
Yeah. Well, this is just one of the projects that we have going on. It's like the spinning plates kind of. So this is just one of the projects that we have going on. As I mentioned, one of our career staff members is working on the AI and education work, and that's a whole work stream that she's working on. We also have all of our digital equity work that's happening with the bipartisan infrastructure law that was signed by the president back in November of 2021. We have actual definitions of digital equity and digital inclusion now. And so we've grounded a lot of the work that we're doing with those definitions. And actually our office priorities are framed as digital equity and opportunity, because once we have that digital equity, we get to those opportunities, no matter the age, range. So we've got other things that are happening as well. So National EdTech Plan is a heavy lift and a large responsibility of our office, but we've also got additional guidance that will be coming out in fall of 2022 around our state digital equity plans that folks will be able to start applying for this summer. That will be through the governor's offices in states to apply for money from the Department of Commerce through NTIA and really help kind of close that digital divide. But then they have to develop a state digital equity plan as part of that. So we are already, well into our process of trying to help shape some guidance around what that might look like, and that will be published this fall. So that's already forthcoming. We are also actively working on all things digital infrastructure. So we've got, we're co-leading an internal working group here at Ed talking about cybersecurity, because that is a huge issue and something of importance right now. They come to our office most commonly because they think cybersecurity, ed tech. We also have other offices that serve in this capacity, our Student Privacy Policy Office, because FERPA is usually involved. We also have the Office of Safe and Secure Schools, which historically has been very physically kind of focused around safe and secure schools, but cybersecurity actually falls within their purview as well. And so we're trying to figure out our role and what we can do there in that space. Also talking about interoperability and accessibility with our colleagues over in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. So we have all of these things that are going on simultaneously, spinning plates, and we'll just continue to move forward with that.
That's fantastic. All right, we are almost there.
Okay.
So last question here. What what sort of resources or where should people go, right? Whether they want to find out more about, I think, your department is obviously sort of an easier one to find.
Yep.
But what sort of things have you seen out there as far as resources, people to follow, just conversations to be a part of, that anyone who wants to be involved in any of this work around EdTech, the National EdTech Plan, you mentioned digital equity, like what are some really great places for folks to go these days?
Yeah. So we will start with ours, tech.ed.gov. That is where our website that has all of the information that I've kind of talked about so far, especially our new work around the digital equity kind of work stream, as well as the AI in education. We launched new pages for those recently. So you'll find blogs there. You'll find kind of our partner work and that we're doing with Digital Promise right now on the digital equity work stream. And then we also have a pretty large social media presence as far as Twitter is concerned. So if you follow Office of EdTech, we have a ton of things that we're pushing out on a daily basis. One of our impact fellows has been working really hard to make sure that we have quality content that's coming out, not only the new content that we're pushing out, but also evergreen content, things that are kind of just consistent and will always be necessary to push out there. So I gotta start there. I would also say anything ed.gov related, they put out so many press releases on a weekly basis. And they've actually been leveraging, I've been really impressed with the way that they've been leveraging Instagram, their reels recently. We have a new member of our communications office, and Linda Lopez, who does like a quick recap at the end of every week. And it's like all the things that we did within the U.S. Department of Education at the end of a week. And that's actually really lovely to say like, oh, that's what they do. Okay. And then of course, Secretary Cardona is active on social as well. So through Instagram or through Twitter. So those are great. In general, we're, kind of making sure that our thoughts and our guidance or any sort of things that we're doing around the digital equity work are using the hashtag digital equity. And then of course, we still contribute to the EdChat hashtag and then the EdTech chat hashtag. And so that's where you will primarily find us as an office and then contributing to the conversations that are happening in the public.
It's funny you shouted out Linda and her work, and I feel like at every level you go to, right, there's always like a person who all of a sudden like transforms the way an entire group works. And you would think that, like I feel like when I was teaching, you'd see like another teacher who did that. And then, you become like a school administrator and you see other principals, assistant principals doing that. You'd think like at some point that stops where like one person can have that big of an impact. But then here you are saying a person on the communications team at Ed, right, is able to have this big impact and shift sort of the narrative around the groups. That's really amazing.
Absolutely. And those communications are priceless. Again, coming from my own experience where I left the classroom to go to the state level, I didn't even recognize what we did as a state agency. I joined the workforce and I was like, I didn't know that's what we were responsible for doing. And I was learning on the job. And then the same can be said when I got here, like, I didn't know that we did that too. So whether it's, guidance around civil rights and protecting our most vulnerable populations or putting out grants that really, create interventions that we can use in classrooms or new technologies or whatever the case may be. That's the role of our department. And I hope that folks want to learn more.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was incredible. So glad we got to spend some time together.
Thank you. Me too. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can be notified whenever we post new content. Looking forward to seeing you next time.